you have never been so well behaved in my 5 years here. Just came to the front and everyone just went silent. That is amazing. Everyone's just too tired. I got myself a chair tonight. It's all right, that, isn't it? Let me just put that there. Evening, everyone. I was saying to Anne and Paul at the start, I had no idea how many people were going to come tonight. Literally no idea. It's not something we've ever done before, and it's probably nothing any of us will ever do again here. It might happen again at this church, but chances are none of us will be here, because that's what happens. We've got a few people online. I want to wave at the cameras there. Hello, people online. Those of you who are online, it's good to have you. And I think the video will stay online as well. So if you're watching live, hello. Or if you're watching back because you're interested, hello. Good to have you. If you're watching live, feel free to pop some comments. My laptop's over here. I don't know if you can see it. So I'm keeping an eye if you pop any comments on there. We will see them. We might give you a shout out if you say anything there. But we're kind of just looking at the last 100 years of Ashbourne Elim Church. It's been fascinating. This is kind of pretty much most of my research that I've been going through. So if you get bored of what I'm saying, just look at that. And you can have a look through some of that afterwards. And if a couple of people want to take some bits home, that's fine as well. Just let me know, because I need to make sure that we keep an eye on where the stuff goes. There's a lot of original stuff in there. But really, we're just having a bit of a conversation and just talking about what God's done here in the last 100 years. But more this evening is about just the kind of the black and white history of what happened, and I guess just thanking God for that. So thanks for your interest. Thanks for coming. Hopefully you find what we just look at this evening a little bit interesting, and also, as with everything we do, it just helps you understand God a little bit more and give him glory. I'm just going to move just a little bit this way, because Paul can't see me. There you go. Now he can. And I think I can see everyone's face. Good. So before we look at Ashbourne, oh, there we go. Who have we got? Ben and Sarana. Just Ben and Sarana. Just the two of them watching this evening. There we go. Ben can see us now. Perfect. Good. Yes, but before we look at the kind of the 100 years of Ashbourne Elim Church, actually it's important for us to look at Elim as a movement before that. Ashbourne Elim Church wouldn't exist without Elim as a movement. We are part of the Elim movement. So we're going to look at, there we go, early Elim first. I'm kind of expecting that I'll probably speak for about 45, 50 minutes or so. That's 1 minute for every 2 years. I think we can manage with that. There's some kind of like blank spaces in the middle of our history, so that we don't know much about that, so we'll rattle through that. But at the start of what I want to do is just watch a video that Elim produced. So Elim celebrated their centenary in 2015. They were formed in 1915. And in 2015, they kind of commissioned a documentary kind of thing that was made. Some of you will have seen it, some of you maybe not. But actually, probably the better way of us as a group understanding the history of the Elim movement in those early days is to look at something that's already been created, which is created well, rather than me telling you things that are just on this video. So we're going to watch this for, I think it's roughly about 10 minutes or so. And it kind of gives us a little bit of the Elim story up to kind of the late 1920s. So there's nothing in there about Ashbourne, but you might pick out the time, around about 1923, where we see that. So hopefully we'll just watch this together, and then we'll look more locally after we do this.
Thursday, 7th of January, 1915. As war raged in Europe, 6 young men gathered in Knox's Temperance Hotel in Monaghan, Ireland. With George Jeffreys, a 26-year-old evangelist from Wales, Albert Kerr, George Allen, Frederick Farlow, Robert and John Mercer, and William Henderson. This almost unnoticed meeting would be the spark that lit the flame that would become the Elim movement. With fervent faith, impassioned prayer, and surrendered lives, these young men had been praying for God to move again in Ireland.
They weren't experienced church leaders or workers, but they had this deep hunger for God and an expectancy that something extraordinary was going to happen. They'd been praying.
George did not go to Ireland with the purpose in mind of starting a denomination. At the first meeting of the Elim Evangelistic Band in the Knox's Temperance Hall in Monaghan, they came together to discuss means of reaching Ireland with the gospel on Pentecostal lines.
And they would soon be moving out across the nation in the power of God with a real faith that their time had come. The Elim story had begun. Born in Maesteg in the Welsh Valleys, George Jeffreys and his older brother Stephen were converted in the first wave of the Welsh revival in 1904. In 1907, he and Stephen were baptized in the Holy Spirit, and they began both to preach with a new fervor and faith, and saw many, many people come to faith in Christ.
Around the world, there was increasing evidence of an outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Events at Azusa Street in Los Angeles, in Norway, in Canada, and in India had brought the expectation of a new Pentecost.
He was invited to speak at the Sunderland Convention in 1913, which was organized by Reverend Alexander Boddy. Whilst there, he impressed a number of Irish visitors, including William Gillespie from Monaghan in Ireland, who sent George 3 10-shilling notes and paid his fare across to Ireland for the purpose of holding evangelistic meetings in Monaghan.
While he was at college in Preston, he was surrounded by young men that were preparing to go to the nations, to Africa and to India, to preach the gospel. George, though, felt compelled to stay in the UK, to his home nations. He really believed that that was what God was calling him to do. And it must, in that environment, have felt like he was swimming against the tide, but it was to be a defining moment. From these humble beginnings, George began to preach in city after city and fill the largest and the greatest halls in the nation. In those meetings, he'd preach the gospel, he'd pray for the sick and see many, many people healed, sometimes very dramatic healings that would draw the crowds, and literally to see thousands converted to Christ. Some have suggested that he was the most successful British evangelist since John Wesley.
In August 1915, they found a disused laundry to rent in Hunter Street, Belfast. George Jeffreys became the first pastor of the First Elim Church.
There were two major factors in the naming of the movement as Elim. One was the use of Bible names for churches and chapels in Wales. The name, of course, comes from Exodus chapter 15, verse 27, where it says of the children of Israel, they came to Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the waters. As such, Elim was an oasis, and this featured very much in Elim's ministry in the early days, where it saw itself as a place of spiritual refreshment and life.
Despite much opposition and with few resources other than their radical faith, these pioneers were totally committed to believing that God would use them through the power of the Holy Spirit to reach others for Christ.
The new movement was set on a course of expansion which would see it grow to 21 workers and 15 churches in Ireland by 1920. It was clear from the beginning, the Elim movement was not simply about one man, however gifted. God was drawing remarkable young men and women together for his purposes. Men and women like Ernest Dara, Joseph Smith, E.J. Phillips, Margaret Straight, and Adelaide Henderson would, in this emerging movement, become outstanding and gifted leaders.
Adelaide Henderson was converted in the Hunter Street Mission in 1916 in Belfast and went out as a missionary to the Congo. She was an extremely influential person in Elim with a strong and powerful personality. For 20 years, she headed up the missions.
In 1921, Jeffreys moved to London. Over the next few years, they would open a Bible college to train ministers and evangelists. They would build a printing press to spread the word of this move of God, and they would plan the evangelization of the nation. With his revival team, he began to travel across the UK in response to the many invitations to hold meetings. The meetings were characterized in every place by remarkable scenes of conversion and documented miracles of healing.
This would become the pattern for George's pioneering ministry. George and the Elim team would hire a venue in a city or a town, and often with little or no advertising. Something dramatic would usually happen in the meetings, maybe a miracle or a healing testimony, and the news would travel around the community like a wildfire. Crowds would flock to the meetings to see and hear for themselves what God was doing.
I mean, it was in all the papers, and if you rode on the trams, everybody was talking about this man who'd come to Birmingham, and he was healing people.
In Plymouth, Carlisle, Liverpool, Dundee, Glasgow, and Bournemouth, campaigns saw huge crowds. Following the campaigns, churches were established to teach and disciple the new converts. Annual conventions were held from 1926 in the Royal Albert Hall. Elim people would travel the length and breadth of the country to worship and witness together, and to give thanks for all that God was doing.
I remember sitting up in the gallery of the Royal Albert Hall in London on an Easter Monday, looking down maybe on 10,000 people, because in those days there was no health and safety. The place was packed, seething with people, and those meetings were charged with the blessing of God. And George Jeffreys' ministry, there's no doubt about it, he was anointed.
At the high point from 1929 to 1930, George Jeffreys would see astonishing results in a series of cities. In Leeds, he saw over 2,000 people accept Christ, and then he started in Cardiff in the autumn, had 51 nights of meetings in hired halls all over the city, and over 3,000 accepted Christ. The very next night, he started in Swansea in the lead up to Christmas, and saw astonishing things as the reporters of the day compared it to scenes of the Welsh revival some 25 years earlier. In every place there were outstanding miracles of healing and great testimonies, and vibrant Elim churches were opened quickly on the wave of that kind of blessing.
It was in Birmingham in 1930 that George Jeffreys conducted his most powerful and effective evangelistic mission. A couple of dozen turned up the first night. There was a powerful healing, and within days the church was packed to capacity. They moved then to the town hall, which had a seating capacity of 2,000, and then they moved to an ice skating rink that had a seating capacity of 5,000, and it was filled every night. And then for the last 2 weeks of the mission, they moved to the Bingley Hall, where some people reckon had a seating capacity of upwards of 17,000. That was filled every night for 2 weeks. At the close of the mission, there were approximately 10,000 converts and 1,000 people baptized.
Cool. I mean, doesn't make you think, oh, I'd love to have seen all of that. Love to have been there. At any point, by the way, if you want to make a comment or ask a question, Brian and Jan can answer some of the questions on Elim. Been in the movement a lot longer than I have. So at any point throughout the night, if you want to ask something or make a comment or whatever, then do feel free to. Can you hear me okay still with that rain? Okay, fine. And then there's this about Elim. We've got this book here, Defining Moments. So this was done in the centenary year. There's a little mention of Ashbourne in it. We got a mention. So I've put it on that page. So do have a flick through of this at some point. And as I say, if you want to borrow it, that's fine. And if you're super interested about like more of the history of Elim, here's volume 1. Here's volume 2. 1915 to 1940. That one's up to 1980. There's a third one coming out soon. Again, you can borrow these if you want to. They tell us more about the Elim movement. But we want to talk about Ashbourne Elim Church. We are a part of a movement, but we are also our own church. And the majority of our time here, we'll be talking about this church and this family and what God has been doing here. So we're just going to jump back a few years. We kind of got up to 1930. We're going to jump back to 1889, which is much before the church was planted. Well, 1889 was when a group of Christians in the area of Ashbourne, decided they wanted to see the full gospel preached into the town. So they built something called the Mission Hall on South Street, which is there. If those of you who don't know where South Street is, if you need reference, at the top there's Benny's. That's my reference point in Ashbourne. Some people might be more akin to go Sainsbury's, but Benny's it is for me. 1889, a mission hall built on South Street. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to the cost of how much it cost them to build it in 1889? £340. Sounds cheap, doesn't it? I don't know what that converts to in today's money, but they spent £340 building this hall here. How many of you worshipped in that hall with us? Just there's three of you here. A few more in the church as well would have worshipped in that hall. But that had a congregation that was really desperate to preach what they called the full gospel into the town. It was a faithful congregation, and it served for about 32 years. But by 1922, the congregation had dwindled to basically nothing. There was a guy called Mr. Rose, who was leading it in 1922. But there wasn't any people there. So the hall was used for 34 years to spread the gospel into the town. And there was a trustee left there called Mrs. Bamford. She was kind of the surviving trustee, and she recognized her duty to what was that building to be used for the full gospel. So what she did is she wrote to George Jeffreys, who we've just heard about. She'd heard about the things that he was doing and that God was doing in his ministry. And she wrote to George Jeffreys. She'd been praying with another lady called Mrs. Prime, don't know their first names, but they'd been praying. They were part of the planting of that church in 1889. And they've been continually praying that God would use that place and use them to proclaim the full gospel into the town of Ashbourne. So when the congregation dwindled, they said, we don't want this building to go into disrepair. We don't want it to be passed on to something else. We want it to continue to be used for the full gospel. So Mrs. Bamford had been healed by God previously in her life, so she understood the divine healing power of God. And as we saw in the video, George Jeffreys and the Elim Evangelistic Band were going across the country. Only 2 years earlier was the first Elim church in England planted, so it's still fairly new for our country, but she invited him to come and lead a campaign in Ashbourne. And the invitation came with a promise of a building. Now, that's not too bad. It's a 6 weeks campaign, and you can have a building. But such was their desire was, you come, if it's successful, we'll give you the keys, and you can start a church here. Which is why so many people have asked, why Ashbourne? Why was Ashbourne one of the first Elim churches in the country? Well, they were promised a building. So they thought, well, not just a building, but a longevity, a succession planning as such. Not just to go in and leave, but something that God could continue. She sent a letter. Miss Bamford sent a letter to George. George, Stephen, his brother Stephen, that was talked about in there, another pastor called Pastor McWhirter, and a lady called Miss Kennedy arrived. They were all part of the Elim evangelistic band that we heard about in the video, and they arrived in Ashbourne train station. I found a picture of Ashbourne train station. Wouldn't a train station be great in our town now? But I found that picture of that. You see the station hotel. Anyway, I like pictures like that. So they arrived at Ashbourne train station, ready to start this 6-week campaign. As I said, 4th of February, Sunday the 4th of February, it started on 1923. And as we know, the campaign was a success because the church was formed. Basically, most of what we know about this time, most of what we can be certain about, is found within a lot of the documents that are here, mostly found within Elim Evangels. So it was briefly mentioned in the video. Elim, at the very end of 1919, so still really in its early days, made a printing press, and they sent out monthly magazines to tell you what was going on in the movement. We do have digital copies of those from 1919 up to the 30s, I think. So if you want to see them, I'm happy to pass them on to you. They're not all printed. Basically, the ones where Ashbourne is mentioned in are printed, and they're seeable in there. But basically, all that we know about is from these Elim Evangels, where they're really just sharing what God was doing and sharing what was going on. So what we read about is in the March and the April 1923 Evangels. It speaks of this great success of a campaign, of how it was a small beginning, and that seems to be, again, a recurring theme within the Elim movement. We'll talk about Birmingham in a bit, but just a couple of dozen people came to that first one in Birmingham, and then you saw the crowds of people towards the end. It was similar here, on a smaller scale. A few people at the first meeting, but by the second one, they booked out the town hall. They like town halls. They booked out the town hall, and more people came, because they did so in faith that God would be glorified, that God would do something, and the word would be spread around the people. So it was that second Sunday the 11th of February 1923, which, according to April's Elim Evangel, was a day never to be forgotten. A day in Ashbourne where really the move of God started. And then we see this here. So this is from November 1923. We see how God used healings really to start our movement off. So this is a testimony from a lady called Mrs. Finney. I don't know if you can read that again. It's available in the files here. But basically, she tells a story of how she lived on South Street, and George and Stephen and the band came, and they came and led this mission campaign. But she was divinely healed. I love her words there. I can now do my housework quite easily. Hallelujah. A bit of a sign of the times, isn't it? That's what was important to her. But this is just one of many testimonies of what God did in that time in February and March in 1923. So we see again that questions were being asked of what's going to happen. The kind of the long-term plan wasn't shared so much with everyone, but they were just enjoying those meetings so much. They said, well, what's going to happen? And then we see of how they had a service where 80 people turned up in the mission hall for a communion service one Sunday night, and the keys were handed over to the Elim movement, and they just praised God and said, yes, this isn't something that's just an explosion and then gone, but something that God can continue and sustain in our town for generations to come. And hey, we're here today because of that. So we see this campaign, 1923, which we are told is one of the most successful campaigns ever held in our town, and I believe it, because we again, all in the evangels, you hear stories of how there were people just singing in the streets, coming out of the town hall and just singing the songs. Children on their way to and from school singing the choruses that they were learning in church, all about Jesus. And then the campaign finished, as I say, after about 6 weeks. I don't know anything about the message, but it's Pastor McWhirter that gave the farewell message, and it was something entitled The Unknown Warrior. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he was talking about, but it's something we know. The Unknown Warrior was the final message of the campaign. But as I say, in many ways, the campaign is the fun part, is the easy part in a way where you're just saying, God, just take it and do it. It's the sustainability which is the hard part. So we see this lady here, Miss Kennedy. She came with the Jeffrey brothers and Pastor McWhirter, part of Elim's evangelistic band. I don't know if she was nominated. I don't know if she nominated herself, but she stayed. And she led the church for the first 6 months of our history. And we'll come back to her regularly because she seemed to have a soft spot for Ashbourne because she came regularly to minister in the town. But I think it's fascinating that we see arguments even in our society today around women in leadership and women ministers, where actually this church, yes, was founded by a group of people, men and women, that came and led a campaign, but it was a woman who was the trustee, who prayed alongside another woman who said, yes, we feel it's right to invite this Elim movement to come, and a woman again who led our church in those first early days. Elim has always kind of been an egalitarian movement and always really believed in the ministry of women within our churches and within his church, ultimately. But as I say, Miss Kennedy led the church for the first 6 months, and then we kind of have a pastoral merry-go-round is kind of the best way to describe it. 30 different people leading the church in its first 50 years. The shortest lasting less than 3 months. In fact, there was one 12-month period where we had 4 pastors serving in just 12 months. So it's kind of very much a merry-go-round of people coming in and out. So we have some very short pastors. We'll talk about the longer-serving pastors kind of later on in the evening because they kind of come a little bit later. But in those 30 pastors, Brian and Jan will know some of the names, but within Elim, within the Elim movement, there's some fairly well-known people who have pastored in Ashbourne. Pastor Greenway pastored here from October 1928. That's such a long time ago, isn't it? He became Elim's general secretary after pastoring here. Then you've got well-known evangelist Pastor Gordon and Pastor Brewster. They've pastored in Ashbourne, and possibly the most well-known, certainly recently, or fairly recently, would be Wyn Lewis, who led the church. He was leading the church in Derby, and he led Ashbourne for a year alongside of that. Wyn Lewis went on to pastor Elim's kind of flagship church, Kensington Temple, took it from 500 people to 5,000 people, and was also leading the Elim movement for some years as well. So we've had some well-known people come through the door, and some people who we don't know much about, but each one of them has been faithful. Pastors and members, right? I know more about the pastors because they're written down, but that is not to belittle at all the work that the church as a whole does. But as I say, all of this is in the Elim Evangels, and we've got within one of those folders there is a list of all of the previous ministers. So if you want to check out some of those names, you're welcome to do so. 1924, we see again in the Elim Evangels, we read of a first anniversary service. I think I mentioned this when we met together in April, where they celebrated 1 year of Ashbourne Elim Church, which seems a little bit silly now, doesn't it? But it tells us of how there was testimonies of salvation, testimonies of healing, testimonies of baptism in the Spirit that had happened all over those last 12 months. And again, I don't know much of the message, but the message was preached from 2 Corinthians 5, verse 1. They don't have to hand. Anyone got a Bible with them? No, you can look at that when you get home. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 1, if you want to have a look at it. Then let's just move back away a little bit from Ashbourne. June 1924, George and Stephen and a couple of the other guys from the Elim movement went across to North America. That's nice, isn't it? So they sent to North America. They ministered in Canada. They kind of traveled around the North Americas, ended up in LA to finish off with. And they met a woman there called Amy Semple McPherson. Now, I mentioned that name when I was preaching about 8 months ago. Does anyone remember why? Oh, Jan's thinking. Do I remember? Amy Semple McPherson was kind of the founder or creator of the word Foursquare. If I say that, do you remember that sermon series? What does Foursquare mean? It's kind of a summary of the gospel of Jesus being our Saviour, our healer, our baptizer in the Spirit, and our soon-coming King. So as George and Stephen and the other guys were out in America, they heard this term Foursquare for the first time in 1924, and they said, yes, we like that. So they brought it back home, and Elim's name was changed to Elim Foursquare Gospel Alliance, which is still our legal name today. So that's kind of where that was. So Ashbourne Elim Church was an Elim church before Elim was a Foursquare movement. Now, they still believe the same gospel, but they just presented it in a slightly different way. But the great thing about Ashbourne being one of the early Elim churches is that we can read more about Ashbourne within the Evangels. In those early days, there wasn't loads of Elim churches when Ashbourne was around, or when Ashbourne was formed at least. So we can find out quite a bit about them. What have we got next? Oh, I had a picture or two that I wanted to do. That's okay. But what we see is when we have more Elim churches planted, I guess this is the picture here, where we see, as was talked about in a video, campaigns in Liverpool and Leeds and Cardiff, Swansea. All of these campaigns led to churches being planted, and more churches being planted through the Elim movement. We start to see less and less about Ashbourne written, and more about some of the other things that God was doing. So there's a bit of a kind of a dry period within the Ashbourne Elim church history in terms of what we know and what we can be certain of. But we know that God was still moving through that Elim movement. I love the story about the Birmingham campaign, and Birmingham has been a key city for Elim ever since then. Brian and Jan have been part of churches in Birmingham, home church there. I'm sure they'll tell you all about Elim in Birmingham. But one of those highlights of the year was this one here. Is that the Royal Albert Hall? There we go, the Royal Albert Hall. Where 70 years Elim met to have an Easter celebration service in the Royal Albert Hall. Now, I don't know when that was stopped off the top of my head. Do you guys know? No, well, it was the 70 years they had it, and they started, what was it, 29? So, yeah, within the last sort of 30 years, 20, 30 years, it was stopped. But we see, countless people coming into the Royal Albert Hall, and people from Ashbourne Elim Church had travelled down and been part of those wonderful moments where the Elim movement kind of comes together. So that's kind of some national things that were happening, but also, go on, yeah? No, please. Great. Nice. Yeah. Oh, I'd have loved to go. Yeah, I'd have loved to have been at some point. Can you share it at the end? Because then I can get a microphone sorted and those online can hear it. Brian's going to share a story about the Royal Albert Hall later, those online. It's a funny one. I'll leave us all in suspense. But yeah, it'd be good to hear. But I'll get a microphone for you so actually people can hear. Bringing it back locally, because Ashbourne was one of the first Elim churches, we were able to host one of the Elim Alliance conventions. So this is like a little advert for it. There's a few churches in the country. Basically, holiday. Go for a holiday in Ashbourne, and we'll put on some speakers in the church, and you can join it. So here we see this was in 1925. This was the first time that Ashbourne held it. What are you laughing at there, Stuart? Away from the sun and the smoke. It's. Ashbourne has always been a good holiday destination, right? But apparently these conventions were really great times. Don't think loads of people came to them, but again we hear little stories of them in the Evangels of how they were blessed times, and they had some speakers here in that first one, W.J. Jeffries and Miss Kennedy. Again, as I say, Miss Kennedy is a recurring theme within Ashbourne. In fact, actually, after this convention, the theme of this convention, by the way, was life. And there was preachers and messages given around the idea of life. Miss Kennedy gave a message about life and life in abundance. We know where that comes from. Pastor Jeffries gave a message themed the characters at the table. Again, I couldn't tell you much about it, but I find it interesting to at least know what those titles were. And then Miss Kennedy stuck around for another couple of weeks afterwards and led another campaign in the town, just a couple of years after, obviously, she'd been pastoring the church. And we hear stories of how people came to know Christ again through her ministry and her work in the town. Skip forward a few years, 1932, Pastor P.S. Brewster, a well-known Elim evangelist, is leading Ashbourne. And then we see this little story of Ashbourne Elim Church. Not much information there, but how it's still going strong. What I like that second paragraph. The church of which this lively band is a branch has been established about 13 years and is one of the oldest Elim churches in the country. Ashbourne's a small town, but a faithful band of saints here. I can say that they love the Lord Jesus. It talks about how they welcomed Pastor Brewster to come recently. And one of the things it says about, I'm not sure it says it on that one actually, but in the full article, it talks about how the music and the worship in the church was led by a band that had spiritual depth. I think that's so important, isn't it, as our team. None of our worship team here today. Just give him a slap on the wrist. Sarana's online. Hi, Sarana. Oh, Anne. Sorry, Anne. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So it tells us something of how we lead worship with that spiritual depth as well. But as I say, it's clear. All that we'll get to that in a bit. That's a fun one. Miss Kennedy comes back again in 1923, just a year later, or a year after that, and the Evangel article about her mission in the town was interesting. It talks about how an old-fashioned gospel brought old-fashioned results. And the reason why it's quite interesting is Elim's only 20 years old as a movement here, but it's talking about this old-fashioned gospel bringing old-fashioned results. And I think it's clear from certainly the first 10 years of Ashbourne Elim Church that Miss Kennedy had a lasting effect and impact on our church. Even though she pastored here for a short period of time, in just those 6 months, she clearly had a soft spot for our church and our town, and constantly came back and was used by God in that town. Now, this one here, Pastor Ball was appointed in 1935, and this is a bit of a difficult period. If you can't read this, don't worry. It's in one of these books here, and you can see it there. It talks of how some letters were sent to Pastor Hathaway, who was a supervising minister to Pastor Bull. And I like this quote that Pastor Hathaway responded. Basically, Pastor Ball was making loads of changes. And Pastor Hathaway said, "You need to stop doing it to," and I quote, "save you from what appears to be a pending disaster in Ashbourne." Now, Pastor Ball's reply held no punches. He talked about people in the church who are less spiritual and less intelligent, holding sway over this church for some time, much to the despair of the rest. Needless to say, Pastor Ball didn't stay too long, and he left in the May, having only been appointed in the January. Now, we can't say who was in the right and who was in the wrong, but we can clearly see that Pastor Ball was not the right fit for our church at that time. Some pastors stayed longer, some for a short period. But this is a very small snippet of a difficult time within the church, just 12 years after its formation. And we'll see more and more difficult times as we go through. Some of them we know about, others of them we don't, and that's fine. But 1939 brought the start of the Second World War, and turbulent times obviously across our nation, but also across our movement. This is a little thing here. I love this. I've actually got this piece of paper somewhere from 1933. If you are on any of our rotas in church, you'll know how Church Suite works. This was their church suite of the day. So this is the rota for our kids' church, our Sunday school, from 1933. I mean, I can't read the writing. But it's fascinating. The paper is so thin, but I can show you that if you want to afterwards. Um, so we see the war starting anyway in 1939. And as much as there's turbulent times across our nation, our movement went through difficult times there as well. So we see George Jeffreys, we saw about him all in the video, and how he kind of spearheaded our movement and led us into great things. In 1940, George had a kind of dramatic split from Elim. There were some practical differences in how they wanted to run churches, but the major difference was a theological difference, and essentially the council within Elim voted differently than George, and George Jeffreys went off. He started a new movement called the Bible Pattern Church Fellowship, but it never really got going, and he passed away in 1962. So we see how Elim as a movement were going through a difficult time, as much as our country and our nations were going through that difficult time in the war times. Elim could have easily folded and could have easily fallen away had it not been for some real godly men and women who steered our movement into the right path. A man who was mentioned in the videos before, E.J. Phillips, was absolutely monumental in keeping our movement together during that time. But more locally, we see in this kind of wartime period, we have a gentleman called Charles Renshaw, who took on the leadership of Ashbourne Elim Church. He was a manager in the co-op's coal department. So because he had that job, he was exempt from going off to war. And so he'd started pastoring the church a couple of years before war. War came, and he was able to continue to pastor the church throughout the wartime, throughout the whole of the Second World War, because of his exemption due to his work. Interestingly, to those of us who know her, Charles Renshaw is Ruth Richardson's uncle. So she was born into this church. She's our longest standing member. She's been here for a long time, and if you want to know how long, you'll have to ask her. I'm not going to tell you. But Charles is Ruth's uncle, and he was our longest standing pastor at that time. He pastored the church for 9 years, took a year break. Someone else came and did a year, and then he did another year after that. So he did 10 years overall, including that difficult period over wartime. But the church actually grew in the wartime, mostly because Ashbourne was obviously a place where people were evacuated to. The Sunday school, which is why I put this one up at this point here, doubled in size. We had teachers come in, women from mostly Southend-on-Sea, the Essex way, and children, obviously, to kind of double the Sunday school time. But we had a church of about 50 people in those war periods, which was a substantial size, considering obviously the amount of people that were away. But Charles Renshaw, as I say, he stabled the church. He was around for that 11-year period, I guess, with a gap of a year in the middle, and he was a real steadying ship through that period. There we go. Got a little picture there of the good old service in South Street. At this point, it's hard to find too much information. We know who was leading the church. We know the pastors, and they kind of, it's still within the merry-go-round period. They kind of stayed between 1 and 3 years at this point, which was fairly common. Ashbourne wasn't not an unusual thing for that to have happened at that period. But as the church gets up to kind of 50 years old, it seen God do some great things in that time, and there were discussions. Anyone know this building? Anyone ever seen this building? It's a former Methodist church, down Station Road. So the church was talking about potentially relocating to this place in the 60s, feeling like maybe the mission hall that it had started in wasn't quite serving the purpose anymore. But it fell through. This place was knocked down, hence why none of us recognise it. But interesting that those conversations started such a long time before we did eventually move to somewhere there. But as I say, there's a kind of like a dark period in what we know here. What we can assume and be fairly certain of is that the church attendance dwindled quite significantly in this period. It happened across the UK post-war and everything around that. And Ashbourne Elim Church felt that as well. And it's said that in the 1970s, the Ashbourne Elim Church was kind of facing its own little crisis there, where we see the generation that remembered and that was part of the revival in the 20s were all starting to get quite old. Some of them were starting to pass away and not have the energy that they once had and the enthusiasm even that they once had to invest their time and their energies into the church. And there was little signs of younger people coming into the church at that point. It's also said that there was a bit of a disconnect between the membership and the leadership of the church. And this caused somewhat a bit of a crisis within the church. Dwindling numbers, an elderly and an aging congregation, and a disconnect between members and leaders. At this point, churches can easily find a way to close. But even in difficult seasons, there was positives, plenty of positives to hold on to. I don't think... Frank and Kath, how long have you been part of the church? 38 years. Okay, so was that early, end of the 80s-ish? Mid to late 80s, cool. So in the 70s, there was a big churches together event, or interdenominational event, that may have been called there, where Ashbourne Youth for Christ was formed, and this was a real positive. And if you speak to people who are maybe around in that time, they'll still remember those kind of campaigns that we did alongside other churches in the area. Well-known people, Clive Calver came and spoke in Ashbourne. Graham Kendrick came and led worship. He led worship in the old Elim Hall up in South Street. And as much as there was difficult times in those 70s period, the church still believed that God wanted to use them and still gave everything that they could in order to share the gospel with those around. But despite those efforts between the members and the pastors, numbers continued to decline, and as numbers decline, often finances decline. So the church didn't have a mortgage on the building, they were given the building, but even despite that, the finances were becoming a problem. So the pastor's remuneration, basically salary, was starting to be reduced, and up to the point where he was asked to serve voluntarily because the church just didn't have the money to be able to pay him any sort of salary. He said no, and he left Ashbourne, and he left the Elim movement at that point. I'm not quite sure if that's all linked or whatever, but that's what we know. But then the church was then led voluntarily by Reg Steele. Many of us know Reg and Andy Cox for a period. So with Reg and with Andy and obviously the members of the church continuing to serve faithfully at that time, where many other churches possibly would have considered calling it a day. But they believed that God still had a plan. They believed that God still had a purpose for us and was still wanting to use us for his glory. And then in 1975, let's get to the mid-70s, the church then is able to appoint a pastor. I'm not quite sure what happened with the finances there or why that was able to happen, but Pastor Philip Gray was appointed in 1975. And then at that point, as he comes in, the church starts to see new attenders, many in their 20s and 30s, which is what the church was praying for and needed, as I said, with that aging congregation. And then Pastor Gray baptized 6 people at one service within his first year of the church, which the church hadn't seen for a number of years then. And he served for 3 years, laying a foundation for what the church has seen steady growth since then, in ups and downs. Following Pastor Gray, David Campbell came. He was appointed here in Ashbourne. David was at our centenary celebration, so many of you would have been there and seen him. One of our national leaders within the Elim Church now. And he was bold and blunt in that he was deliberately targeting younger couples, and he made no apologies for that. Some people would say that was a little bit brash, and it's okay to do it without saying it, but he made no apologies, and he told everyone that's what he was doing. But actually, in doing so, what he found was actually that he was bringing in new people who would be real steady and firm foundations for the church for years to come. So he served for 7 years at the church. A number of people came, and he worked on the leadership structure. In fact, this is probably one of my favourite photos of him. This is David Campbell baptising someone. That's such a wonderfully timed photo, that one, isn't it? What a great photo that is. But then we see kind of a decade of growth and this solid foundation happen kind of within that years of David Campbell. So we see a young lady called Sheila Shipton marry Brian Stafford. We see Carolyn Wicker marry Paul Steele within the church. And these two couples, if you've been around for a little while here, you will know formed a real great foundation, served on leadership in this church for decades to come, and were married under David Campbell and became integral in the leadership team of the church through his work. But the church continued to grow, continued to be kind of steady. And I think that would be fair to say over the last 30 years of Ashbourne Elim Church. We have been steady, we have been faithful, and just allowed God to use us in his gentle grace. 1990s came, and in those mid-1990s, there were some difficult times. Frank and Kath will be able to speak into it more than I will. I'm not going to ask you to. But there were some difficult times, and again, some kind of unrest amongst the members, some difference of opinions around changes, and I believe questions about the songs that were being sung. Songs always cause disunity within church, don't they? That's not a new thing, by the way. It's always been the way. But there's a disunity that's kind of brewing, and it all kind of comes to a head at an AGM, which is why pastors never like AGMs. And an elder's vote is taken, and one of the elders doesn't get the votes needed to continue in that position. And basically what happens is the elder walks out, and a number of the church go with them, and the church has a split. In its bluntest possible way, the church split in the mid-1990s. A church called Ashbourne Christian Fellowship was formed, and that's still going today, 30-odd years old. And is still serving God in our town, and we pray God would bless them. The preacher in me can't help but say that God never wants his church to be disunity to be in his church, but he will always restore and he will always redeem what we do, and Christian Fellowship is continuing to do the work of God in this town. So we have this really difficult time where the church splits. And again, in church splits times, churches can easily fold. And once we look back at those difficult times in our church's history, we can see how God still has a plan, and God is still faithful, and God still wanted to work in his grace through us. As I say, these are my kind of understandings of these things. You might speak to Frank and Kath, you might speak to some of the older members of the church who have been around a long time, and they might be able to tell you more about it if you want to, and if they're open to doing so. But I guess through it all, the idea is that we've had difficult times, but God has seen us through. And after this split, we have, I don't know if you can see him in the middle here, Pastor Alec Prale. Here he is taking our young people away to the Isle of Man. Thinking it's written down as the Isle of Wight somewhere, but I was corrected in it. It's the Isle of Man, I'm pretty certain. So Alex at the back there. Again, many of you would have heard Alec preaching in the church, was that a couple of months ago? And Alec was our longest serving pastor within the church's history. 13 years he did. Honorary mentions in terms of longevity go to Paul Hammond, who did 11 years. Charles Renshaw, as I said, did 10 years over 2 periods. But Alec did that, served for the longest period. And Alec, as I was chatting to him when he was here a couple of months ago, he, in his own words, I'm not speaking this over him, in his own words, was the mature, older head that was brought into Ashbourne to steady the ship. He's saying actually that, don't worry, this is just a group that use him while they're he said that he was, in his understanding, the only pastor that had been appointed to Ashbourne who was over the age of 30 in a long time. And it's interesting actually that even after Alec, that the kind of the trend and the theme of younger ministers has continued in Ashbourne. Who knows what you'll get after me and Vanessa leave? Not that we're planning on doing that. Whether it might be an under 30s again. But Alec was brought in as that kind of level head to steady the ship, to bring some maturity, and again to build foundations for what God wanted to do. Some foundations had already been set, had already been placed in a really healthy way, but we believe that God wanted more. And Alec believes what the greatest thing that he left the church was a building fund. Now, I disagree with him because I think God has greater things than buildings, but actually we see over the next few years that God used that for his glory and for his expansion of his church. So in 2009 he left, and then Pastor Ben Brown came. Many of you will know Ben, possibly most, with a few exceptions, will know Ben. So Ben came, and from my belief would be that actually Ben's arrival brought about probably the most changes the church has seen for many years, if not many decades. Ben, if you knew him, if you know him, is an enthusiastic man, full of energy and ready to hit things as hard as he possibly can do and get things moving. And that certainly happened in his time at the church. So he came in straight away, did some renovations in South Street, is that right? And eventually led us move into here, Waterside Retail Park, to where we are now. Church of around about 25, is that about right, 25 or 30, that was meeting in South Street, moved into this place. So 3 of you here, thank you for your faithfulness in that time. I'm sure it wasn't easy. Philip, one of our elders, often tells a story of how he, I think he said there was a few of you, kind of just stood in the middle of the room and looked around and said, what have we done? But that church of 25, 30 people gave so faithfully, financially, time, and just sacrificed so many things that they could have done because they weren't content with where they were and believed that God had greater things and a greater vehicle for his mission. God doesn't care about buildings, but he uses them as vehicles for his mission in places to serve him. So anyway, we ended up moving here. We were able to do that again, as I say, but because of the sacrificial giving of the church. They also managed to sell South Street site, £147,000. That's a bit of a profit, isn't it? From the £340 it cost to build. 147,000. The church also had a manse that was sold then, 169,000. So that put together a large part of the deposit of what was needed, alongside obviously a lot of fundraising. September 2011, we moved into this place. There we go. You might recognise a face or two there that were part of the celebration of opening, a bit of a fun day outside, where the community was able to come and give thanks to God for this place that he would use. But as I said, as Ben came, kind of brought about a decade of intense change within the church. And not only did we move buildings, within a couple of months, Ashbourne Food Bank was formed when we moved in here. It started off very small, a ministry that was serving a handful of people. Mike now is serving 70 people every week, 79 people last week, feeding many, many people. Hit its peak in the COVID times, over 100 people every week we were feeding there. But it's in those small, again, we see it within the history of our movement and the history of our church. There are small beginnings that God uses and grows. I wish the food bank wasn't needed, but I thank God that we're able to serve him in that way. So we see the food bank being formed within just a couple of months. So the church moves into this building, starts a food bank, and then many other ministries in that time, ministries that are new, ministries that have been moved from South Street to here are starting to grow, and that church of 25 people is growing to the point where they appoint their first assistant pastor or minister in training just within a year of moving to here, which probably feels like longer than that. I don't know how time tends to do that. But within a year, Neil and Sarah Stokes, Neil Stokes came in as a minister in training in the church and helped the church grow, continue to grow. The changes kept coming, right? You guys remember this, I'm sure. A church was formed or planted in Bakewell, that from here, the church, in April. Oh, I've got a picture. There you go. April 2013. The church originally met in the Medway Centre. Then we rented our own premises in Bakewell after about a year of meeting there. So we met every Sunday, and the church here was responsible for that. That was a plant out of here. 3 years later, 2016, another plant is formed in the town of Wirksworth. So for about 2 years or so, a little bit longer maybe, this church here was responsible for 3 different churches across the Derbyshire Dales. We've got Ashbourne, Bakewell, and Worksworth. Alongside these church plants and new ministries, we've got loads of kids and youth works continuing to happen, ministries for different ages, ministries just in general. We've got a charity shop open in town that Mike ran. The church was very active in its social action in the town. So alongside the food bank, it was running CAP courses, money courses, job courses, release groups, people with addiction, and that sort of thing. 2019, Ben Brown left, went to take on the pastorship of Stafford Elim Church. And I think it would be fair to say, again, I obviously wasn't here in that interregnum period, but I think it would be fair to say that was a stretched time for the church in more ways than one. The church was still trying to run 3 different sites, 3 different churches. Financially, the church was starting to struggle again, and it got to a point where the decision had to be made to close the 2 plants of Bakewell and Worksworth in order to focus on this congregation here in Ashbourne. And that was made kind of end of 2017, beginning of 2018. Then April 2018, Vanessa and I turned up. Again, recent history. And it's kind of hard for me to comment on this period, I guess, because I'm biased. But for me, as I kind of think about what we have done, I say we as in us as a church have done over the last 5 years, there's kind of a few little highlights for me. In COVID, apparently the UK church sort of dropping 32% drop in attendance post-pandemic, but that hasn't been the case in our church. We actually have seen growth in a pandemic. If you were around at that time in the pandemic season, you might remember this kind of image that we gave of how we grew in a pandemic. We grew numerically a little bit, but actually we grew in ourselves. We grew as a church. We grew in our town. We grew in stature, and I was really just amazed by God's grace that He poured out over us in that pandemic season. How we booked the trend of the UK church in general. Obviously, there were other churches as well that did great things, but for us as a small market town church, I think for me one of the highlights was how we managed to cope in that time. One of the ministries that really thrived in that time was our Connect groups. I know I mentioned them on Sunday. 86 people in our Connect groups at the moment. We'll get up to 100 soon, I reckon. 100 people in Connect groups, which is just fantastic for a church our size. Another one of personal highlights for me is our response to help Ukrainians. There you go, a little picture of Zoe. Now, I'd forgotten about this, but within weeks of the invasion, within days of the invasion, our church ended up being this hub of the town, and we ended up sending off a few vans to the border of Romania to help refugees that were crossing over that border at that time. In a real practical way of, right, okay, how can we help in this emergency? But once we'd sent those vans, the Rotary Club, actually their meeting tonight, they kind of started doing things through maybe their more formal procedures. So we just kind of handed that over to them. But in doing so, it allowed us to help people in our town, in our community, host Ukrainian refugees. And I'm still so amazed that as the war started in those first kind of 3 or 4 weeks of the Homes for Ukraine scheme that our government put together, Derbyshire Dales was one of the top districts in the whole country in terms of how many Ukrainians we were welcoming. And as a church, we played a huge part of that. We linked Ukrainians with people in our town that we're hoping to host, and are still in regular contact with a lot of those hosts today. Many of them never connected with churches before. And obviously it's great that we've got our Ukrainian church now that meets every Saturday. They have about 30 people that meet in our foyer. So as much as we gather, about 120 people here on a Sunday morning maybe. Actually, we're a church of 150 now every week because we've got 30 people who we don't see, but they're gathering and they're meeting and they're worshipping Jesus, and they're doing his work alongside us as part of his church. And these are two kind of personal highlights for me. We've obviously had other great things, and I could speak for an hour about the last 5 years. But that would be unfair because I gave myself like 2 minutes per year, or a minute per 2 years or something, didn't I? But I guess the kind of the thing that we see with within this church is God moves in miraculous ways, but also he is so gracious to us in that he has, over the last maybe even 20 years, just been giving this church slow and steady growth that is manageable, that is wonderfully wonderfully representation of his heart, where we see people coming to know him, and we get to be a part of that. It was great on Sunday, just for those of you who I asked who's joined in the last 2 years. So many hands put up in the fellowship. And this is what we want to see. We want to see people come into the church. Many of those are transfer growth. And if that's who you are, then that's great. We love that you found a home here. But God's heart is for kingdom growth. And this church will continue to be used for kingdom growth in this town and in this community and beyond. But I guess I thought I'd just finish with a little picture of some things from years back and some things more recently. Just to remind us that as we now kind of write our own part of Ashbourne Elim Church's history, we are standing on the shoulders of giants that have gone before us, that have been faithful in running the race, some that are now with him in glory, some that are serving him elsewhere, some that are still part of this church. But we are here because of their faithfulness, but most of all we're here because of his faithfulness to each one of us and to this church. And we'll be here again until he comes back, or until he says, actually, Ashbourne Elim Church, your time is done. Sometimes that's okay as well. And he'll call someone else to do his work here. But that's kind of a flying history of our 100 years. I said I'd give opportunity for anyone to speak, ask questions. Just a couple of things on here. Dave Garrett says hello. Ben Brown says that's not Ben Brown. David McElroy says that's an understatement about Ben Brown. And Ben and Sarana do confirm it's just the two of them still. Have a think if anyone's got any questions. I'm just going to get a microphone for you, Brian. And you can share that story for us. We'd love to hear it. There we go, Brian. We've all been on the edge of our seats. No one's been listening to a word I've said because they've just been waiting for this story, Brian.
It's just that going back to the Easter Monday. I'll do it this way. Yeah. Easter Monday.
Sorry.
Thanks. We used to, from Birmingham, a lot of us went down to Birmingham, to London on Easter Monday. And we had, as Jan said, we had the Trafalgar Square big declaration out in the open air. And then we go from there to the Royal Albert Hall. And that year, it turned out that in our church, we had a men's voice choir. And we were chosen to sing for Easter Monday in the Albert Hall. And so we practiced and whatever. And that's fine. So we got there ready. I was a bit older than that, but yeah, not very old. So we got there and were told that we were going to sing in the evening of the service. So we arrived there and we went and sat on the top layer of the Royal Albert Hall. So we were miles up to top there, you could see these tiny people on the platform. And we just got in there and sat down when the person announced, he said, we were, as usual, getting from the other side of London. The convener said, we're going to finish this song, and then afterwards, the Selly Oak male voice choir are going to sing. And I heard that while I was at the top and thinking, I've got to get all the way down there to get onto the platform, and there's these 4,000 stairs to get back down. So I dashed down, all the way around, pushed me past everybody, and got into my position where I was supposed to be, just for this guy on the platform, just for the guy to say, oh, sorry, they're not singing this afternoon, they're singing tonight. So I couldn't get off. I couldn't get off again. So I had to stay for the whole thing, and then in the evening go back into it. And we did sing eventually and whatever.
What did you sing, Brian? Do you remember?
Oh no, I can't actually.
Ah, I was
It
gonna
was
ask you
one
to
of
give
the
us a
typical
rendition.
sort of those type of songs we would sing. Coming Again, probably. Coming Again was a popular one.
That was a favourite.
Yeah, Coming Again. Yeah. I'm not going to start it. Don't worry. It's not that desperate, but whatever. It was a good choir. Yeah, it's a good choir. We did that, and we joined with others who were part of it too. But it was just funny, to collapse there and whatever. With all my friends laughing because they knew it was going to be upset. But anyway,
Thanks,
yeah,
Brian.
thanks.
Anyone, any questions, comments, any testimonies they want to share? Comment from George who says, I see a rainbow through the window as you speak of God's faithfulness. Great to remind us. Great. Thanks for coming. No idea how many we're going to turn up, but it's great to see many of you here. As I said, do have a flick through the files there. If you want to take anything home, do let me know. That's no problem at all, but I'd like to know where it's gone rather than just take it. That's okay. Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, have a look through.